So thanks, Charles. This is really super interesting. Another figure in the evolutionary psychology movement has recently made this kind of move is Clark Barrett in
Oh yeah, yeah. Is that Shape of Thought book?
Shape of Thought, yeah.
Yeah.
And the whole book is basically an attempt to make this kind of flip where he says, no, what's really adapted is plasticity. So
Yeah.
we get the kind of point that you want to make falling out of just changing our perspective on what we take to have been adapted. I guess I worry in the cognitive architecture case, and now I'm also flipping those worries over to the human nature case, that doesn't sort of provide enough substance to really make calls about what gets in and what gets out. Now it might be you might consider it a virtue of your view, and this is kind of where I ended up after the paper, that things are kind of continually evolving. You know, human nature itself is evolving, and we can see that as part of a broader evolutionary process. But I wonder how you restrict things like the latest meme that happens to have, attain some degree of contagion from getting in. So it seems like it seems to me that to have a substantive notion of human nature, things have to be stable enough in some vague sense. And I wonder how this view prevents sort of just continual shifts with, even pop culture or something like that, to put it flippantly. So that's one worry. And then if I may also a second thing, you didn't really talk about it much in the talk, but I was interested in the paper about validity and contingency.
Oh yeah, I left that out because then after rereading it, I had the sense that it was like a little bit off to the side. But
okay, well, actually, never mind. No, never mind. I'll save it, and then I'll if we have time at the end, I'll bring it up. So if you just want to take that.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So I guess the main question is how do you get a substantive theory of human nature on the kind of view that I've been suggesting, and I guess there's probably more than one way to do it, but one way would be sort of at the population level. You could say something like, enough people have to be engaged with the meme, if you want to use that idea, for long enough, and that some threshold is crossed. But maybe you could do it in terms of the brain itself, because if on neural reuse you do have, neural reuse is not like an equipotentiality kind of view. It says there really are structures that realize particular behavioral and cognitive functions. It's just that those structures are sort of wispy. They come and go. But so let's look at whether a particular structure gets sort of, dedicated to a function, like maybe there would be some trace at the structural level, and it may end up being the sort of thing where you need to impose a threshold. But like the case of reading seems like an interesting candidate because through development, you can look at the brain and tell whether someone is a reader or not, without actually having them read. There's cortical thickening and various sort of physiological traces. So I guess that's one response. That would, I don't know. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to see it developed, I guess. One thing you could do is rely on canalization, right? So there's whatever the statistically normal traits are, if literacy is now widespread or whatever, are going to be things that you should expect to have a canalized developmental pathway, such that not only can you see it in the brain of someone who's currently literate, but you could probably predict how their brain is going to look from a sort of normal starting point plus a standard developmental pathway. So that prediction might not be something you could get for I don't know, being really interested in the Kardashians or something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so thanks, Charles, for your paper. So let me briefly summarize what I take to be the argument, and then I'm going to ask a couple of questions. So I take it that you're interested in the question, what the organization of the brain might tell us about human nature. Okay, so that's your question. And in your paper, you are answering this question on behalf of, say, a specific brand of evolutionary psychologists. Their answer to that question is positive. They make a distinction between acquired and evolved traits or capacities, and they claim that human nature consists of this bunch of evolved traits. So for this claim to go through, you need a buffer in neural structure. So you need a mapping between neural structures that realize, say, evolved functions, and neural structures that realize acquired or modern functions. And then you argue that this bells and whistle hypothesis is false, and therefore the view of human nature of the brand of evolutionary psychology you take into consideration must also be false. So that's the argument on the table. Okay. So if that's the case, here are a couple of big picture kind of questions. First question has to do with the distinction between acquired versus evolved. From your quote from Pinker, say, I would also have emphasized the common logic, say, phrase in that quote, which makes me wonder whether, say, the evolved nature has less to do with, structure, that is physical stuff, and more to do with maybe the topological organization of, brains. So the first question is, how do you understand the difference between acquired and evolved? And the second question is, do you think that an evolutionary psychologist might respond that a focus on structural connectivity is just misguided? That is, if you want to track, structures that map onto evolved functions, you better be looking at, invariants that are topological, okay, and that might put constraints on the trajectory of, the changes in brain structure. So that's my second question about the notion of organization on the table.
Yeah, I think those are great points. So, yeah, if there were, so I haven't read, well, maybe Clark Barrett is someone who would want to head in that direction. But I suppose that topological invariance of some, so I guess, Matteo, by topological invariance, you mean we've identified changing network structures already, but then some of the topological features of those changing network structures don't change, and that invariance becomes the sort of a thing that's stretched out through time that's not itself a structure, and that explains the buffer, you used a good word for it. I guess that would be a cool view that should be developed. I suppose I haven't read about a view like that, but if one exists, then that seems like a natural place to look, and maybe that would be the right way to save the bells and whistles hypothesis. And I think that view, I guess an interesting question, I don't know the answer, would be whether that view is compatible with the view of neural reuse as, say, Michael Anderson understands it. And then you also asked about the common logic idea. I didn't, so what, can you restate that? Maybe I didn't quite catch it.
Common logic was related to this idea of, a template or invariances that might, be something else than anatomy. You also mentioned effective connectivity So you might maybe, find, causal structure that remains invariant over changes both at a phylogenetic level and also ontogenetically. Again, this was more, a question about whether a focus on anatomy is the best way to characterize what evolutionary psychologists are after when it comes to human nature. The other question was about the distinction between acquired or versus evolved or innate, as it were.
Yeah. So just let me revisit anatomy before I go to innate. So I think gross functional neuroanatomy is definitely the wrong place to look because it's just, it doesn't change that much. I mean, it can change to some extent, right? Cortical thickening and stuff like that. But, and, the brain-machine interface experiments show that, cortex can change on an anatomical level. But, yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know exactly where the border is between anatomy and physiology, but learning happens somewhere at that border. And, so I don't know how to pinpoint the right level. Maybe it has to be at a lower level than the one that I've been exploring, and if so, then I just sort of would invite someone who wants to defend something like the bells and whistles hypothesis to point in the relevant direction. Like I said, this is somewhat exploratory. But then with regard to evolved, acquired, innate, I think I've been convinced by people like Griffiths that the idea of innateness is sort of not a very stable concept. And at least in the presentation, I think I used the word once maybe in the paper, but in the presentation I tried to avoid using it. I think there could be evolved ancient functions that are not innate because they only appear in certain environments. So that's assuming a certain view of what innateness is. So the distinction I'm going for is between simply those capacities human beings have that couldn't possibly have come to be a long time ago, and those capacities which certainly did come to be through some mixture of evolutionary processes a long time ago. So I think that doesn't, the word acquired might be a troublesome word there. So I guess the contrast should be between ancient and sort of obviously modern rather than evolved and acquired.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, Charles, thanks very much for the talk. The more this discussion continues, I'm actually concerned about this notion of human nature and what that is supposed to be. I heard that you said you didn't want to say, or you don't exactly know what it is, but it seems to me, since all of this is about what's human nature and what's supposed to be in it, we need to think about it a little more. And in your reply to Matteo, now to his second question, something came out about capacities, and I was wondering during the talk already whether maybe rather than talking about traits being human nature or human nature consisting in certain traits, we should think of human nature of having dispositions or capacities to develop certain traits. Because then the story, seems to me at least, becomes a lot less mysterious. Because we have a brain, we know it adjusts to the environment, and we know genes get activated, and depending on which input we get, depending on which environment we're in, depending on, well, what we do. And in a way, that seems to be true not only for the brain, but for the whole body. Like, we know our bodies have certain capacities we are born with, but we develop them depending on how we are raised, how we are educated, in which environment we live. Like, movement patterns, well, part of that is innate, but part of that is exposure and practice. And the same might be true for the brain. And all we know about how the brain develops and brain plasticity kind of matches what we know about plasticity in the whole body. So It's kind of two questions in here. And the first one is like, how should we exactly think about human nature, and would it be plausible for you to think about it in terms of more dispositions or capacities? And then the second one would be why is it exactly that we are thinking so much about just the brain when we're thinking about human nature and not just all of our capacities and traits?
Okay, yeah, very good questions. So on the nominalist conception of human nature that Machary gave, that's from a paper in philosophical psychology called A Plea for Human Nature. He is talking about traits in addition to psychological ones. So, you know, motor programs can be included. Yeah, I don't see any reason to deny that. But I think I was particularly interested, for the sake of this discussion, in broadly speaking, the psychological aspect of human nature. And in the sort of like more heated, more politicized discussions about human nature and how plastic humans are, and nature versus nurture, the traits that seem contentious tend to be the cognitive and the psychological ones. Yeah, so I mean that's a practical reason for focusing on the psychological ones, but it's not sort of a matter of definition or something. And then you asked me sort of what do I think human nature is, given that, you know, this is focusing a lot on it. Well, I tend to be quite skeptical. I'm not ready to claim that there is no such thing as human nature, but my own view is that if there is such a thing as human nature, it's a pretty thin. The only workable, like empirically justifiable conception of human nature is going to turn out to be very thin. And one of the reasons that it'll turn out to be thin is precisely as you suggested, because it's probably best characterized in terms of dispositions that are somehow open-ended, that are sort of incomplete unless you add in a particular sort of developmental environment. And that's the view that I think Clark Barrett has been trying to defend. He came up before. But then the question is whether that kind of view is compatible with the idea that human nature is somehow ancient. Like if your definition of human nature, your conceptual analysis of human nature, right off the bat makes it clear that things like driving a car and reading a book are included within the set of capacities that we're characterizing as human nature, that's okay. It's just a very different conception than the one that evolutionary psychologists have typically advocated, because it's supposed to be somehow essentially connected to a set of adaptive problems we faced a long time ago, and those, you know, we obviously didn't face a long time ago. So I'm happy with the idea that you suggest. I think it's just an idea that is maybe not quite as bland as you made it sound.
All right. Thanks for now.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Hey, Charles. My name is Ernesto Restrepo Ladefors. I'm here in Sweden. I'm trained as a neuroscientist and biologist. And now, lastly, I'm interested in philosophical problems. And I am quite interested in your paper because it's touched quite, I will say, more biological, anthropological issues, not just only philosophical ones. Actually, it's quite a lot of biology in your paper. Then what I noted at the beginning of in the introduction of the work is that you touched a problem that was pointed by, it was here in 2010, you might know it, in behavioral brain science, about the weirdest people. It is about it's a study showing, a meta-study showing that most of the studies about cognitive brain function in humans was carried out in Western, educated, rich.
Yeah, Joe Henrich's work. Yeah, exactly. I know. Uh-huh.
Then that is precisely one of the points you make at the beginning. I think so that is quite close to that. And in point of there, for instance, you see the problem of the Muller illusion, for instance, that is most of us is being fooled by that illusion, but people in the Calgary, the foragers, for instance, they see the lines, you know, this illusion. They are not.
Yeah, exactly.
The same
they don't
way.
grow up in the city with a lot of right angles.
Exactly. Well, that is quite interesting point, and I would say that it would be important to include it because it's quite work that support what you are starting with. I mean, that way. The other thing I wanted to make in the paper is that you say something that I think is a little bit, maybe you make a mistake writing it. When I say fossil evidence suggests the neocortex has grown and changed faster and more recently than visual areas. I mean, visual areas is also neocortex. There you make a mistake.
Oh, I meant frontal. Yeah, thank you. That's
sorry for that. But the important thing, anyway, I know what you mean. There's a diversity of variation in the neocortical areas that show that there might be some adaptability response from some regions with respect to others, and that shows some kind of evolutionary change in relation to adaptation. But then I have a little discrepancy there because I have the impression that there is no need to suppose.
Oh, Ernesto, I lost you. All of a sudden, I can't hear.
Ernesto, are you still with us?
Oh,
Ernesto?
Yes.
Okay, we lost a part of your question. So
yeah, okay. Then my argument was that not all the structures or functionalities are necessarily can be understood from the perspective of being adaptative. They could have been appear, like Stefan Jay Gould once suggested, in as adaptative forms. For instance, feathers in birds were not have been was a strong evolutionary evidence that suggests that the feathers appear in order therefore warm up the reptilian bodies, but they were actually used later on for flying. Okay, that is called adaptation. I think it's interesting evidence that not all the functionalities of the brain might necessarily be adaptative. Yeah, I just want to finish with this. I am sorry to use your time. Is that in certain way you are right about the fact that neural reuse make credible the anthropological, for instance, assumption that make glyph forget.
Okay, yeah. So sorry, Ernesto, if you can hear me. I'm sorry we lost you, but I think I got a lot of what you were saying. So the first point was about Joe Henrich's work and other work in that area on how a lot of experimental psychology and neuroscience has focused too much on highly educated young Westerners, and that might introduce various forms of selection bias. Yeah, I agree entirely. And if we wanted to understand, the diversity of human cognition, we definitely, I agree wholeheartedly with that point of view. And also, if we want to understand the range of effects that different developmental environments can have on cognition and emotion, et cetera, then yeah, that seems important. And then you asked a question about adaptation versus acceptation, and yeah, I was trying to put myself in the shoes of sort of a standard evolutionary psychological view of human nature, where I don't think there's anything intrinsically, there's no reason to say that everything is an adaptation, but many of the important features that give us like if today, on the basis of behavioral evidence, you're going to reason about, and if on the basis of evidence about the little bit that we know about what Pleistocene conditions were like, if you're going to reason from those two premises to some conclusion about how the brain works, you're probably going to be relying primarily on what you take to be adaptations. That doesn't mean that you exclude the possibility of acceptations. It's just that those are going to be more difficult to reason about. But yeah, I think I agree, and everyone else should agree that acceptation is it happens quite a lot.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. It's pronounced Wojciech. Nice to meet you.
You too.
My name is Wojciech Mach. I'm from Warsaw, Poland. It was very interesting to hear your talk. I got three things to say.
Okay.
The first thing that springs to my mind when you're talking basically about this, defending the borders of the neural mechanism or some task domain structures, what springs to my mind is the problem of encapsulation, because that's basically the same problem. So I was wondering if you could comment on the relation between the two distinctions that you made between acquired and evolutionary stable distinction and the ancient modern one. How does it bear on the distinction between perception and cognition, and about the problem of penetrability of perception? Do you think this is a kind of an analogous problem, and how does it bear on this whole idea of neural reuse? The second point that is corollary to the first one is some philosophers that did the work on cognitive penetrability of perception, for instance, Ned Block, suggested that there are some methods to differentiate the one side of the border from the another one, namely some quantitative methods, for instance, the response time or some measurements of the information flow. I am familiar with some of your work on the measuring of the information in the brain, so perhaps you can elaborate in this direction. And the third thing I want to say is maybe not really a question, but just an idea. Perhaps there's a pretty obvious or pretty simple solution to this overriding problem of neural circuits. You can perhaps differentiate some parts of the brain which are like analogous to the system files in the computer, which are not overridable, and the other ones which are kind of a domain which could be overridden in a sense. And if so, could you perhaps point to some mechanisms that could suggest to us how to differentiate one from another? How do the brain defend these particularly fragile and crucial parts to not be reused or overwritten, to endanger its functions? Yeah, and that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Wojciech, I think is the name. Those are deep questions, and I'm not sure I have very satisfying answers. So the first one is about encapsulation and cognitive penetration of perception. I don't myself have a very established view on the issue of penetration, but I think you're right to point out that it seems connected, because if you are a sort of a hardcore, massive modularity theory person, then I think you are committed to there being only a limited form of cognitive penetration, because if there were sort of if the border between perception and cognition were entirely fluid, then of course you couldn't refer to cognitive modules or perceptual modules. And that makes sense. Like, so neuroscientists who have more associationist commitments tend to think that perception and cognition flow freely into one another. Whereas, those who have a more representational, computational view of the brain are typically more open to a modular view that involves little penetration. Okay, then you said Ned Block has some views about how to draw the distinction between cognition and perception, and you suggested that they're quantitative. I don't really know what to say about that. Maybe there are quantitative methods. So I thought briefly of the work of Olaf Spoorns. You know, there are quantitative measures of networks in the brain, both functional, structural, and affective networks. And you know, maybe you could try to figure out what's overridable, as you put it, and what's not, by looking to those distinctions, which I suppose are, in a sense, quantitative, right? The structural connections would be the more permanent ones, and then affective and functional connectivity are more modifiable. But I suppose the difficulty there is that if the theory of neural reuse is correct in the way that Michael Anderson has suggested, then I think that the distinction between structural and affective connectivity itself becomes somewhat blurry, because there are learning mechanisms that actually, you know, change the wiring diagram of the brain.
So here's a follow-up related to something Daniel was asking earlier on about temporal scale. So suppose that you have the wiring, the connectome of a human from 300,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, what would it take for that connectome, say, maybe reconstructed artificially, to provide evidence for the bells and whistle hypothesis? So you have the full, connectome of a brain from 3,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. You wire it up. Let's assume it's a baby brain right now. What would we take now in that situation to have good evidence that the bells and whistle hypothesis is true?
That's a great question. So I thought about something similar, and I mean, well, let me give you the straight answer is that I unfortunately don't know, because the way that I tried to describe the bells and whistles hypothesis, it was not something that I'm sort of already committed to, or that I think is clear, but I think it's something along those lines seems to be required by the kind of evolutionary psychological view that I was positing. But yeah, so the first answer is I don't know. Second answer is the notion of the connectome, at least in the way that Sebastian Seung uses it. I think it's supposed to include the synaptic weights. So it's not just an unweighted graph. So if you think that most learning is Hebbian learning, and you've included those synaptic weights, then I think the right answer to your question is you wouldn't be able to tell. There would be no evidence. It would be impossible. But we know that, or at least I think it's safe to say we know that there are other forms of plasticity and learning in the brain, and I suppose you'd have to look there. Yeah. But this is speculative because all those other forms we don't know as much about them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but yeah, that's a really cool question. Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi.
Oh, great. Well, so now I'm gonna go back and ask about the validity and contingency.
Oh yeah, please do.
So, I mean, I guess I'm thinking about sort of Jackie Sullivan's worries about how you take a complex cognitive task and say that this is what you're measuring, because any effect you get, it's hard to parse out some processing of the stimuli, which are, I take it culturally contingent in your sense, in many cases of cognitive tasks, mm-hmm. versus the operation that's actively being performed. So Jackie talks about this with regards to Stroop tasks, mm-hmm. Or at least certain varieties of Stroop tasks. And I guess and this is just kind of an invitation for you to say more while we have you on the line here. I think once you get into the contingent, dynamic neural assemblies, this problem just kind of gets compounded for me, because now not only are you dealing with a sort of indeterminacy about what is being performed versus what's processing of the stimuli, now you've got a bunch of neural areas that we all admit could be performing multiple different functions. So how do you look at them and say, well, this is sort of what this area is contributing in this assembly? This is something that's never been quite satisfying to me in the Anderson picture. So I guess I just want to hear more about your perspective on sort of how the transient neural assemblies work and how we parse out the different functional aspects of the task, given that that's the kind of unit we're looking at.
Yeah, gosh, that's a really good question, and I'm sorry I don't have a great answer to it. So
me neither. I was hoping you'd tell me.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to disappoint you. Yeah, so I'm not an expert, although I've begun recently reading about this stuff, but I don't know how well, Anderson's view of neural reuse could be distinguished, could be split up into two parts. One is the more negative thesis that, well, it's also a positive thesis, but the part that I was talking about, which is that we shouldn't expect to see a certain kind of localization thesis go through because of transience. But then he has a positive side too, and I suspect you might be somewhat more skeptical about the positive side, which is that given the truth of neural reuse, we have to do cognitive neuroscience in a new way, and we have to focus on the functional fingerprints or something like that. So his idea is to go super data driven. And I am a little bit skeptical about that because I think so I'm not, apologies to Jackie Sullivan, but I'm not entirely familiar with her work on the Stroop task, or at least I can't recall it right now, but I'm imagining that the worries that she raises could be raised as worries for that positive side of Michael Anderson's project.
Yeah.
I would share those. So I think they're just sort of like oddly collected data can't replace carefully designed experiments that are tailored to uncovering a particular phenomenon. So the only answer I have is more carefully tailored experiments, maybe with more emphasis on multivariate pattern analysis and that kind of thing. Going beyond old-fashioned region-based analyses. But I don't think there's like a major conceptual shift that'll give us a magic bullet and solve the problem.
Yeah, cool.
So my question sort of ties in with the earlier question I asked on human nature, but also hooks up to something in Dan's question. So I'm wondering, in response to my earlier question, Charles, you said that maybe the notion of human nature that results would be too thin. But then, if we have something like even reading will be about nature, that seems to be too thick. And I was wondering where you would see the ideal, if there's something in between that would be desirable, and if so, like what would give us evidence for that?
I guess the question is desirable for whom? If we're so my talk got started by trying to put myself in the shoes of evolutionary psychology, and my own view is quite different. I mean, I might not. I guess I see the human brain as something that sort of becomes what it is as a result of a developmental matrix, and there's more than one kind of plasticity, and modularity is, if there's modularity at all, modularity should be a developmental rather than a structural notion. So I'm happy with all of that. And then I guess, tell me if I'm not getting your question at all, but I guess this is where I'm left at the end of what I've said today. if we're going to have a view of human nature at all, it should be maybe thin and thick are not that most helpful concepts. It should be open-ended. It should be something that can change. And you know, I think in that paper we were talking about before in Philosophical Psychology by Machary, he says that human nature can change. But I remember noticing that he just writes that as one sentence and then moves on to the next paragraph, different topic. He doesn't say how it can change, like what are the mechanisms of change. And I presume, I may be wrong, but I presume that on his view that human nature can change insofar as, you know, natural selection or other evolutionary processes change our genetic profile. But on the view that I'm ending up with, human nature can change in developmental ways, not just genetic ways. And, you know, epigenetics, of course, is going to be involved, which blurs that distinction a bit. But yeah, so I guess the view of human nature I think is ideal is a big tent view. It doesn't rule out a lot of stuff. It's one in which we can let lots of things in, and variation is going to be part of it. You know, humans in very different cultures are cognitively unlike we are in lots of interesting ways, and that has to be taken into account. So I guess it's got to be a loose, big tent kind of conception of human nature. Does that help?
Yeah, can I follow up?
Please, yeah, go ahead.
So if it's a big tent, do you think it would be useful to try and find more abstract categories in that big tent so you kind of get chunks? Like, we know, for instance, that superior temporal gyrus is super specialized in hearing people in patterning sounds. It's in most of the people who just speak some natural language, it's specialized in phoneme recognition. And in many expert musicians, super specialized for recognizing tones. And we also know that in signers who are not hearing, these same areas are specialized to recognizing the grammatical units that correspond to spoken language phonemes. So it's like the movement pattern, even though it's an auditory area. So maybe thinking in more abstract terms and characterizing this as like it's in our nature to recognize patterns of something, of units. Maybe that would give us more of a handle on this question, like what's in our nature. Just thinking.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So, from a very naive perspective, there are two kinds of problems you can run into when trying to characterize human nature. One is that you end up with a list of characteristics that many other species have, and therefore doesn't look distinctively human. The opposite mistake is to have a list of characteristics that only a small group of humans have, and therefore also not distinctively human. That would be like a cultural subset. I suppose I find the second mistake worse than the first mistake. And so if that's true, then maybe you're right. In order to take into account the difference in the neural capacities of trained musicians and non-musicians, we would have to ascend to a more abstract level of analysis. There are multiple ways to do that, and you know, maybe, I mean, to bring Clark Barrett up again, he suggests that I don't remember now if he connects this with human nature specifically, but he says that the evolutionary, our evolutionary heritage, or insofar as evolutionary heritage is detectable in modern humans at a cognitive scale, it's in sort of what he calls cognitive reaction norms rather than you know, fully developed cognitive dispositions or cognitive capacities. And that would be one way of going abstract, by saying it's the reaction norms, a set of, you know, the human nature is composed of a set of reaction norms rather than a set of capacities. I think that's a plausible way to go. But I think that if you go that way, then you end up saying things like, reading and playing the piano get sort of included in a derivative way because, you could think of it as kind of a dilemma. When you say that reaction norms or some sort of developmental program or something like that, something abstract, is the units that we're going to be counting when we write down our list of things in human nature, then either the developed products of those reaction norms are to be included or not included. And if you do include them, you get driving and playing the piano and reading books. And if you don't include them, then you're left with something radically more abstract than traditional conceptions of human nature have allowed, like the ones I started with at the beginning of the talk. So either way, that's a form of, there's an interesting confrontation there. Yeah. I know that was, I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I think it does.
Good.
Thanks.
Perhaps, Charles, if I understood correctly, you are willing to admit some degree of historical contingency in the definition of human nature. Now, perhaps you can bring some culture into the evolution itself. If you look at some modern synthesis projects like, you mentioned sterility during your talk. You probably heard about a niche construction framework that quite elegantly, as far as I understood it, brings evolution, brings cultural development into evolution, and it makes things quite interacting. So perhaps if you aim to sketch a notion of historically contingent human nature, or that is shaped both by genetics and by, say, epigenetical factors, then that's a good literature you can look in. What do you know about it? What do you think if you know something about it?
Yeah, I do know a little bit about it, and that's sort of another area that I've been reading a bunch about recently, and yeah, there's definitely a connection. So earlier we brought up the literature on cross-cultural cognition, right? And I think in the history of cognitive psychology, and cognitive neuroscience, most of the discussions of how culture influences our thinking has been oriented towards cross-cultural comparisons. But the idea of niche construction, or just more generally, gene-culture coevolution, is important because it reminds us that, culture has radically shaped who we are for a really long time. And my favorite example there is probably cooking. So there's certainly nothing in our genome that is like an instruction for cooking food. That's a cultural innovation that's contingent, and nevertheless, our ability to cook has shaped our stomachs and our teeth and our jaw, and probably has shaped our cognition as well. So yeah, that's evidence for the claim that insofar as we have an evolved human nature, it's both a result of cultural and genetic evolution. So I agree entirely with that.
Thanks, Charles. A really interesting paper and discussion so far. And I was wondering about one thing, sort of the necessity of neural reuse to establish that conclusion. So, for instance, we could think, I was thinking about epigenetic mechanisms to reshape traits in humans that don't change like DNA structure. So that's also like a field that, recently has picked up a lot of steam and is interpreted in a way that you get perhaps a more flexible notion of human nature out of. And so you could link this, of course, to the brain. So you could think about environmental cues reshaping gene activity patterns about brain development, right? So basically, brains nowadays develop differently than brains in other environments because it results in changes in epigenetic mechanisms, but that could be completely independent of the actual significance of neural reuse. So I'm wondering how you would respond to that. So whether it is sort of like you want to insist on this peculiarity of neural reuse, or whether you would accept that it could be a variety of mechanisms that we have evidence for that speak against this distinction between modern and ancient traits.
Yeah, okay, very good question, and the answer is definitely no. I wouldn't insist neural reuse is unique here. Yeah, certainly there are going to be culturally determined epigenetic differences between us and our ancient ancestors. But, the question I started with was, what can we learn about human nature from the brain, from what we know about the brain? And so, given that starting point, epigenetics may still have an interesting role. I think, at least as far as I'm aware, we don't know that much about how about which mechanisms epigenetically would have been different back then and now. So, like, you can do cool experiments where you give, rat pups exposure to their mother or not, and that introduces some epigenetic changes. But I think it would just be more speculative to try to say there are particular epigenetic changes that have kicked in as a result of our modern environment and technology and all that stuff. I'm sure there are. I just don't know which ones.
Right. No, but just a quick follow-up. That's why I said you could also link this a bit more to brains if you would think more about brain development and how, like brain development is just changed without, and that's sort of independent of whether in any given task there's these transient neural structures, right? There could be more stability in some, let's say, more basic or whatever capacities in terms of the brain structures but yet how they develop ontogenetically is different than how they have developed in former times. So I guess like sort of tying that, and that might have to do with like which genes get expressed to which levels, right, in shaping the brain. So perhaps it could also be possible that the development of our brains is already so different, then even if neural reuse turns out to be less significant, you still get this sort of intertwining. So
yeah,
just as an idea, it's more like
no, that's a great idea. I think you're probably right, and I have a lot to learn about brain development. So it's my next project.
Okay, cool.
Okay, if there are no other questions, I just have a very brief curiosity about the example you mentioned about the visual form areas that, if I understand correctly, overlaps with the area involved in the recognition of faces. Is it right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, just one simple explanation that came to my mind, that's, well, this area may be involved in fine-grained visual processing, very complex visual processing, and this explanation can explain both, of course, the case of face recognition, because faces are the most complex visual stimuli in the environment, and also the case of letters. So I don't know, I'm not an expert in that kind of discussion, but is there any account that tried to explain the overlapping in this way or not?
Yes, definitely. So Stanislas Dehaene, his work does exactly that. And he's got this very interesting account. So I think I mentioned briefly in the talk that reading is like any capacity, it's something that is built on the back of, precursors or more ancient capacities. And so in the case of reading, he thinks that our object recognition system is attuned to certain kinds of angles more than others. So we're like better statistically at detecting certain sort of families of angles. And it turns out that you can find these angles in common in many of the writing systems across human culture. So including characters like in Chinese and in the Roman alphabet. And so his view is that writing culturally evolved in order to sort of adapt itself to our neural biases, which come fundamentally from how object recognition works, and that those very basic features of object recognition both constrain and help to explain our peculiar facial recognition capacities and our reading capacities. So yeah, there's definitely a backstory to all of that, which is much more complicated than I've made it sound. But I think it remains kind of a cool example, because reading just seems like a dramatically distinct capacity from the kinds of things that people did, say, 30,000 years ago.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles. We are really run out of time. We can thank you.
Thank you all for great questions and for listening to my chaotic talk.
Thanks for the paper. Good talking to you all.
Pleasure.
Yeah, good talking.